Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ross Wallace. I'm a principal at Santis Health and an advisor to the Resilient Healthcare Coalition. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all today to a webinar on accelerating patient access, the progress and possibilities of innovative payment models across Canada. Over the next 90 minutes, we're going to have a wide-ranging and detailed conversation with some leading experts in this field, laying the groundwork for many more conversations to come and reflecting one of the most important and timely issues and opportunities facing all of us committed to accelerating access to innovative medicines and biopharmaceuticals across Canada. This webinar is being presented in partnership between 20 Cents and the Resilient Healthcare Coalition. The RHC is an organization dedicated to two fundamental goals: accelerating access to innovative health technologies and optimizing the use of healthcare data. And obviously, there's a very important connection between those two objectives, and we'll dig more into that over the course of the next 90 minutes. We'll just wait 1 minute or so just to give a few more folks an opportunity to jump in. Then I'll talk a little bit about sort of housekeeping for this session, and then turn it over to Dr. Jason Field, co-chair of the Resilient Healthcare Coalition, to offer some introductory remarks before we introduce all of the participating speakers. So we'll be with you in 1 moment. Okay, as I watch our numbers climbing, and in the interest of respecting all of your time and your ability to be with us, those who are able to join right around noon Eastern Standard Time, let's get started. I'll tell you just a moment to remind you of the session and format of this webinar. Our time together today is going to be anchored by a presentation from Allison Wills of 20 Cents. Allison is going to highlight the promising role of innovative payment models, and then she will sort of then cede the floor to some very thoughtful responses from a number of panelists, all of whom are reflecting different and complementary perspectives on this issue. Then we'll lead into a moderated Q&A session. In terms of questions and answers, we're happy to accept questions at any point through the arc of this discussion. So you will see on your Zoom screens a Q&A button at the bottom, a little icon with a question mark. Please feel free to submit your questions at any time. They will go into a sort of curation funnel, and we'll have an opportunity to reflect on all of those questions, answer as many of them as we can, and look at, what are the most common themes, how are the questions lining up with each other, and we'll respond to as many, and the panelists will respond to as many as they can in order to maximize our time together. So please use that function, and we'll do the best we can to make sure as many of your voices are heard in that fashion as possible. Perhaps without further ado, I will now take this opportunity to introduce the speaker giving our opening remarks. So Dr. Jason Field is the president and CEO of Life Sciences Ontario, the industry voice for the life sciences sector across the province. He is also a co-chair of the Resilient Healthcare Coalition. He obtained his PhD in chemistry from the University of Massachusetts. Then he worked in the pharmaceutical industry and then for the government of Ontario. So Jason, to you to kick things off.
Thank you so much, Ross, and welcome everyone to this webinar that will be exploring innovative models for the reimbursements of medicines. As Ross mentioned, I'm Jason Field, President and CEO of Life Science Ontario, but really here today in my capacity as one of the co-chairs of the Resilient Healthcare Coalition, or RHC, as we lovingly refer to it. RHC is really a unique organization in that it brings together a diverse group of health system leaders from industry, research, advocacy groups, right across the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. Our mission is to create health systems that are faster, nimbler, and therefore better able to absorb system shocks, much like what we experienced during the COVID-19 pandemic. Because of our unique makeup, we are well positioned to be the conveners of stakeholders within our health ecosystem. And we can convene stakeholders to have what can sometimes be difficult conversations. But it's these types of conversations that are the most important because they're the ones that will eventually move the needle in terms of building resiliency into our healthcare systems. Our work focuses on two specific areas, as Ross mentioned. Optimizing the use of healthcare data to better inform healthcare decisions, and also expanding and accelerating patient access to innovative health technologies. And that includes everything from vaccines and diagnostics to therapeutics and medical devices. And this is why today's conversation is so important to RHC and our members. A few weeks ago, I had the opportunity to attend a screening of a documentary film called Of Medicine and Miracles. It tells the true story of the very first pediatric recipient of CAR T treatment for leukemia. Her name was Emily Whitehead. She was 5 years old at the time and literally on the brink of death when this revolutionary personalized therapy was made available through an experimental clinical trial. That was back in 2014. Not only did the treatment save her life, it cured her cancer. When I was at this screening, I had the opportunity to speak to her father, Tom Whitehead, who was actually receiving texts from Emily as she was attending her first year of college, which was just amazing. And the reason I'm telling you this story is, first of all, it's an absolute inspiration for all of us that work in life sciences and in healthcare. But the other reason is that this is a great example of the future of medicine. It's personalized, it's targeted, and it's often curative, but it's also inherently more expensive. So we need to be innovative about how these medicines are made available to patients in a timely manner so we can save more lives like Emily's. So really looking forward to the discussion today. We have a great lineup of panelists. Thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy this webinar as much as I'm looking forward to it. So over to you, Ross.
Jason, thanks so much. And that's a fantastic sort of underscoring of the purpose and the power and the potential of conversations like this. So I'll just take a moment to introduce all of the fantastic speakers that we have gathered here today, starting with our headliner, Allison Wills. Allison is a partner at 20 Cents, a Canadian pharmaceutical research and consulting firm that was a core focus on implementation of managed access schemes, innovative market access agreements, and real-world data for Canada's pharmaceutical stakeholders. She is the co-chair of the Real World Evidence and Outcomes-Based Agreements Working Group, publisher of the Canadian quarterly magazine, The 20 Cents Report, and has co-authored 4 peer-reviewed publications on real-world evidence and the implementation of innovative market access agreements across Canada. She's born in Manitoba, grew up in a remote Ontario town, educated in France and Montreal, and holds an MA in International Business. So we'll be hearing from Allison momentarily. And then 4 fantastic respondents after Allison's done her core remarks. Alphabetically, we'll start with Raelynn Douglas, the Executive Director of the Drug Plan and Extended Benefits Branch in the Saskatchewan Ministry of Health, and the CEO of Ray Soleil Consulting, a company that specializes in building resilient teams. Before her current role, Raelynn worked for the Saskatchewan Ministry of Finance in multiple senior roles. Working in the Ontario healthcare sector, she developed a deep commitment to addressing health human resource shortages, which led her to complete an MBA and build her own consulting company. As Executive Director of the Saskatchewan Drug Plan since August of 2022, Raelynn is excited to lead major expansions in pharmacy scope of practice, navigate federal provincial pharmaceutical landscape, and empower innovations that help ensure a sustainable program for the long term. Lisa Machado is a leading Canadian advocate for patients and caregivers. She's been invited to speak and moderate at numerous events in Canada and around the world about what it's like to live with a chronic cancer, gaps in healthcare policy, barriers to patient care, including drug access, and the importance of supporting caregivers. Her experiences as a patient, a caregiver, and advocate for her brother and her father have given her unique and thought-provoking insights into what it means to be a consumer of healthcare in Canada and the challenges facing patients as they seek the best health outcomes. Andrea Masters is a Strategic Access and Pricing Director at Hoffmann La Roche Canada. Andrea is an accomplished and creative reimbursement expert with over 20 years of experience in pharma and 14 years in pricing and contracting. She has a deep understanding of the Canadian drug reimbursement ecosystem, both on the public and private side, plays a number of key roles. She's vice chair of the IMC pCPA operational team, leads the Innovative Agreements Initiative at IMC, and is part of IHE's Health Technology Innovation Program, HTIP, looking at innovative agreements. And last but definitely not least, Dr. Nicole Mittmann, CDA's Chief Executive and Vice President of Scientific Evidence, Methodologies and Resources. At the Canada's Drug Agency, her teams include health economics, science and methods, research information services, drug data, analytics, and publishing. Nicole's teams are involved at the beginning, middle, and end of programs and services to support and lead work at Canada's Drug Agency. At CDA, she promotes active learning, assures rigor and quality, links science to strategy, and shares evidence through CDA's journal and other sources. So with that, I will turn it to Allison Wills to get this conversation underway. Allison, to you.
Thanks so much, Ross. And hello, everyone. I see there's a lot of folks on the line, I think from in Canada and from abroad. So thank you for joining us today, and to all the panelists for being here as well. So in the next 30 minutes, I'm going to take you through a very high-level look at the progress and possibilities of innovative payment models here in Canada and how they can contribute to accelerating patient access. Just a few disclosures. I'm an owner and an employee of 20 Cents, as Ross mentioned. Our clients are from both the public and private sectors, and I co-chair the Real World Evidence and Outcomes-Based Agreements Working Group, which receives research funding from its industry members. So, and the current members are listed there. All right, so let's just jump into this. Today's agenda is fivefold. Number one, why discuss the progress and possibilities of innovative payment models in Canada? Then we're going to look at what are managed access frameworks and outcomes-based agreements. Then the current state of these access frameworks and outcomes-based agreements in Canada. And finally, what is needed to continue to advance the opportunity for timely patient access to novel therapies. And after that, we'll have a robust discussion with the entire crew that is on the line today. So let's just jump right into it. Why discuss this progress and the possibilities of innovative payment models in Canada? There's a couple of reasons why, and I think you likely are familiar with them if you work or have lived or have experience in the space trying to access medicines. So healthcare decision-making has become increasingly challenging due to high uncertainties. What we've been seeing is that many novel therapies with a high unmet patient need are coming to market with limited but immature and promising evidence. Phase 2 data are increasingly being used as primary evidence for public reimbursement. And sometimes, the randomized clinical trials, controlled trials are actually not possible. Patient populations are too rare. And that makes it very challenging for HTA, NCVs, and other healthcare decision makers to determine the value of products and make recommendations about those therapies and how they should be listed. There's some data that's been published on this on the right, and it shows a little bit, shows how oncology therapies have been reviewed, comparing those drugs that have phase 3 data with phase 2 data. And it's no surprise that when comparing them, drugs with phase 2 data are less likely to be recommended by Canada's drug agency. So uncertainties are high. And timely access to novel therapies has also become increasingly challenging for patients. It's no secret that here in Canada, it takes more than 1.5 years for Canadian patients to get access to a new drug in public plans. And that means it's around from its regulatory approval to the first public listing, we're looking around 630 days. We've also, we are amongst the slowest of the OECD 20 countries to reimburse innovative new medicines through public drug plans. We're actually 18th of 20th on that list right now. Also, what we're seeing is that other countries have implemented formalized pathways and frameworks to enable timely patient access while managing all of these high uncertainties. So on the left, you see many countries, including England and Wales, France, Germany, Italy, Australia, and others have established pathways for publicly funded early access where patients can receive treatment while evidence collection is ongoing. And here in Canada, we don't have a formalized early access pathway at present, but there's some things going on that kind of resemble that. So we'll get into that in a few moments. I want to give you one example of these international pathways. So how can a formalized pathway and framework enable timely access for patients? And often we look to the UK, they have a robust established system. They've been doing this managed access, and they have some funds that are set aside to support therapies that go through these pathways. So look, in the UK, one example here, we have a lung cancer drug. Back in 2021, on May 7th, it received its regulatory approval in the UK. And by combining an early access agreement and one of those funds, the Cancer Drug Fund Managed Access Scheme, actually 100 patients received immediate access and to this treatment at what's called day 0. So the same day that the regulatory approval was granted, patients were able to have access. And the NHS put out a press release on there on May 7th. That's what you'll see on the right. So it followed that pathway. It went through the process of therapy. And then in November 2021, more than 600 patients were able to access treatment ongoing, Well, additional data was generated prior to that final evaluation. I just looked last night, and as of yesterday, or as of June 7th, actually last publication, this therapy continues to be funded under the Managed Access Program as part of the Cancer Drugs Fund. So we can imagine between 2021 and 2024, many more patients have had access. Just out of curiosity, I took a look in Canada. We also did have Health Canada regulatory approval quite early, so in January 2021. Our processes, though, don't have, we didn't have this type of framework or pathway for managed access. So it took a little bit longer. We just saw that delay, a year and a half, and this followed suit. So we saw Jan 2021 regulatory approval. The CADTH recommendation was available on September 2nd, 2021. And then the pCPA negotiation process concluded on October 7th, 2022. It's just interesting to see that different pathways can support timelier access. And really comes down to patients are patients, doesn't matter where they live. They need access to these therapies. And in the UK, it was quite exceptional. They did get access quite early for this therapy. Okay, so what are managed access frameworks and outcomes-based agreements? Now, I want to call this section ABC 1, 2, 3. What do all these acronyms mean? We already heard this morning in the intro RCH and OBAs and different things. So I'd like to take you through this to clear up some of the acronyms you may have you've heard in this space. And hopefully this help will be removed and not found in the soup after we get through it. So you may have heard things like MAA, MEA, PLAs, OBAs, TLR, PTAB. What are these and why are they important for patient access? So let's start on the left. I've tried to break it down into 3 groups for you. So first of all, we have frameworks, and the little globe is showing there that internationally these are used, but not right now in Canada, as I mentioned. So frameworks, these are types of formal managed access frameworks that are used internationally. We hear things like managed access agreement, managed entry agreement, managed entry scheme, coverage with evidence development. There's more acronyms. Trust me, there'll be more that you'll hear of. But overall, what's a managed access framework? As mentioned, to manage uncertainties, many countries have applied adapted HTA and listing pathways to enable patient access while developing additional evidence. And these frameworks have often been utilized in publicly funded drug plans with single payer systems in which that HTA recommendation and the listing decision are made in tandem. So, as we just saw the example in the UK, there was a regulatory approval, there was an HTA recommendation, and a listing all happened at the same time. And I really like the way that NICE, that's the HTA body in the UK, that they define or explain in plain language managed access frameworks. It's all right on the right. I'll just read it to you. This is from their website. Managed access gives people faster access to promising new treatments. Otherwise, they might not be recommended because of uncertainties about their clinical or cost effectiveness. It also helps ensure value for money for taxpayers and offers companies a route to the NHS, so that's NHS funding, that's the public funding, for treatments that are likely to be cost effective. During managed access, more evidence is collected to address any uncertainties about treatment using a managed access agreement. We then use this evidence to assess whether the treatment should be made available for routine use on the NHS, so it's in the public system. Okay, so that's what the frameworks are. Let's move on a little more to these other acronyms. The second grouping I have for you here are agreements. So these are types of market access agreements. They exist internationally, here in Canada, and I put 2 flags because we're going to kind of break down Quebec and the rest of Canada a little bit later. But yeah, across all the provinces, you likely have heard of PLAs, which are product listing agreements, and typically traditional product listing agreements here in Canada are rebate-based, so it's volume based on a rebate. But all of these other ones on the bottom you see here, innovative agreements, outcomes-based managed access agreements, outcomes-based PLA or value-based agreements, these all have a little bit of a nuance to them in the sense that there would be some data collected. So I'm going to use the terminology outcomes-based agreement, but really I want you to think in a more general way. If you hear of an innovative agreement, it means something beyond that rebate that we just see in a typical PLA. So let me explain to you a little bit of an OBA, an outcomes-based agreement. It's a market access agreement between a pharmaceutical manufacturer and a payer in which the manufacturer will issue a refund or a rebate to the payer based on how well the therapy performs in a real-world patient population. It's measured against an agreed-upon, predefined set of benchmarks. So if you see here, we combine managed access agreements, those frameworks, and we could potentially use an innovative agreement like an OBA to address these high clinical or economic uncertainties that create barriers to timely patient access to the promising therapies. And they also enable that access while mitigating the risk for payers. We saw in the NICE definition, they're talking about value for taxpayers. That's all of us. All of our governments are working hard to make sure that they are using the funds appropriately to address the needs of Canadians. And at the same time, these frameworks and agreements enable additional evidence to be developed to support healthcare decision-making ongoing. So very key about managed access agreements, managed access frameworks and agreements is that data is important. We heard here we're collecting new data. So as part of these frameworks and agreements, we always will have that financial agreement. Could be a simple product listing agreement, the PLA. But here with managed access and with innovative market access agreements, there will be a data element. So we need to collect data to support new evidence generation. So very key in all of this. All right, let's keep going. So now we know about frameworks, we know about agreements. What are these other things? The AES, the TLR, and the PTAP. These are processes. So we have Canadian processes here that resemble managed access like approaches. So if you remember, I said we don't have formalized managed access frameworks here where we have the HTA recommendation linked directly to that listing like they have in other countries that have enabled some of these agreements to enable timely access. But we do have things happening. So we're going to talk a little bit about alternative economic scenarios. We're going to talk about timeline recommendations and the pCPA's temporary access process. So this is that final slide that I think maybe is the key takeaway here if we're looking at definitions. So we have frameworks, agreements, and processes that support timely patient access. On the framework side, as part of those managed entry agreements or managed access agreements, there will always be a financial agreement and a data part. On the agreement side, it could be a simple agreement that is matched with that managed access agreement, but there could be an innovative market access agreement such as an OBA, and that would also include data collection and financial agreement always. And then here in Canada, as we're unique, we have processes that are resembling these approaches, and we're going to talk about that right now. Okay, so what is the current state of managed access and outcomes-based agreements in Canada? So at present, we don't have a formalized managed access framework. And as I said, there's been much investigation going on by Canadian stakeholders to understand the effort, the benefits, and the outcomes of frameworks and pathways that are used internationally. To date, given that lack of formalized processes, we already have here some manufacturers and payers looking to outcomes-based agreements, either through the pCPA or directly between a payer and a manufacturer to help enable timely access to some of these therapies. Some formal processes and activities have been initiated in Canada that resemble managed access and OBA type approaches. So let's look at Quebec, where their policies and processes to enable timely access are truly have been leading the way for Quebecers, but also for us in the rest of Canada to see how potentially to use some of these mechanisms. So on the left, I'd like you to note that in 2017, actually in 2016, the Quebec put out their 2017 to 2027 life science strategy, which included a commitment to expedite access to promising new drugs. And they also enabled legally for INESSS, that's Quebec's HTA body, to take a promise of therapeutic value approach. Which that means is that there are therapies the files that they would receive where the therapies had high uncertainties, and then the law actually enabled them to provide a recommendation that said there's a promise of therapeutic value with that drug. So since then, we've had quite a few, probably around 10 therapies that have come through that have received a positive recommendation from INESSS with the promise of therapeutic value. So that's enabling it not to stop at that process with a negative, but go on. And we'll talk about an example in just a moment. INESSS has been in the middle. We see that INESSS has been quite active in conducting ongoing strategic intelligence research on timely access mechanisms and conditional reimbursement schemes. So as they've been getting experience with the promise of therapeutic value pathway, they're also working on seeing what's going on internationally and elsewhere here in Canada as well. And very recently, last year in June, INESSS issued an invitation for manufacturers to submit what's called alternative economic scenarios. That was one of our acronyms, AESs, to be sent to the minister for consideration along with HTA advice. So the intent here was to open up an opportunity for manufacturers as part of their regular file to put through some sort of outcomes-based agreements or innovative market access schemes that they could propose, that INESSS would then also pass along to the minister with their recommendation about that therapy. And I think, in discussions with INESSS and some of the publications that they put out, they said that its intent is to enable like a playground really for the manufacturers to demonstrate willingness to participate in managing risk and show how it would be possible to implement some sort of innovative market access agreement. So as you can see, there's been some building blocks in Quebec over the last years. And it's kind of quite an interesting time as we're coming up to sort of a new step in Quebec. I wanted to give you first an example of this promise of therapeutic value. So back in 2020, Zolgensma is a CAR T therapy. That recommendation was one that came out as a positive with a promise of therapeutic value. So I'll just do a little translation here for you. Promising treatment, and they had some conditions around listing, recommending to list with RWE generation plan and a clinical follow-up of patients on therapies, a médicament d'exception status, so reduction of economic burden, and sort of saying that the manufacturer should put in place a large real-world data initiative to show effectiveness and safety of this therapy. So that's an example of a type of, how the language was shown in the promise of therapeutic value. So we saw positive here. Now, just back in March and this month, in June 2024, we saw that INESSS is now committed to re-evaluating those therapies that did have a positive listing with promise of therapeutic value. Galafold and the CAR-Ts and Spinraza are all noted there. And actually, just as I was putting this together, I saw that last week on June 3rd, 2 of the CAR-Ts that had received that promise of therapeutic value positive recommendation, Kymriah and Yescarta, their reassessments were published. And so, originally promise of therapeutic value, and now INESSS has recognized the clinical value, the therapeutic value of these therapies. So they're no longer going to be under the promise of therapeutic value. They continue, the recommendations to continue to have them listed with conditions. And also very interesting, I'll have to dig into this a bit more, that both RWE, real world evidence, and additional clinical trial data were used in these reevaluations. So we should expect to see more, as noted by INESSS in this presentation back in March, that they are going to be looking at other CAR-T therapies. Spinraza for SMA and Galafold for Fabry disease are next on their list. So more to come with that. I'll just finish off on Quebec. I had the opportunity to speak with Dr. Michelle Deguise, who's the president and general manager of INESSS last year. And we talked a little bit about outcomes-based agreements, and I really like what she said. So I wanted to share it with you. So these mechanisms, she said, aim to distribute the risks associated with treatments that show promise, but have as yet uncertain value, so we don't delay access to patients. There's certainly a role for these treatments, but it's a challenge to determine how to best deploy them. This makes it essential for stakeholders to work together to develop a realistic and efficient frameworks for managing and mitigating the risks of certain innovations, while ensuring the agreements include clear direction on how to use the data collected to support them. So a lot of themes that we're hitting on here that she spoke to: not delaying access to patients, working together to develop realistic frameworks to manage and mitigate risks, and ensure that the agreements have direction on how to collect data. Lots of things going on here, a little more complex than putting a simple rebate contract in place, we can acknowledge, but I think it's also feasible. So to watch, continue to watch Quebec would be my recommendation to you all. So let's look at the rest of Canada now. So we have some other Canadian policies and processes to enable timely access. And I would ask the question, is this our path to our first truly managed access framework here in Canada? Last year in September, Canada's Drug Agency, formerly CADTH, they put out a time-limited reimbursement recommendation process and procedures. And these are recommendations that are time limited and contingent on evidence generation and formal reassessment. It's only intended for therapies that receive notice of compliance with conditions and that for which clinical trial data will become available in the next 3 years. This does not right now include real-world evidence as a potential data source. It did leave some room for openness on a case-by-case basis. And of course, here, this is the HTA process. Here it stops at the HTA piece. There's no link to listing. However, the folks at the pCPA, they put together a temporary access process, and that came out in July of 2023 with a recent update. And so they developed a set of principles and conditions for a temporary access process to inform the negotiation process to get to an agreement. And for any drug and products that come out of CADTH's time-limited reimbursement recommendation. So really interesting here, I want to point out is that right now, the sort of the playground for this process is around NOCC drugs, so the opportunity. I wanted to pull out how, what is the opportunity to support timely access through the TLR and the PTAP process. So let's look at what's the opportunity? Notice of compliance with conditions tracking. So this is Health Canada approvals by year. So from 2020 to 2023, there were 24 drugs that received NOCC approval. So we have about 6 per year that are going through this process. And this year, as of June 1st, we see 1 drug has received NOCC and 1 drug is under review for NOCC. So since it takes around 8 months for Health Canada review of an NOCC submission, there'll likely be only these 2 files this year, which is kind of interesting to reflect on the goal of TLR and PTAP, the goals of it, and also is to support timely access. And at the moment, perhaps with this, with NOCC being the scope of it, is that the timely access or the extent to which we would like to have timely access for patients just to potentially 2 therapies per year? See, it could change year by year. As with Quebec, they sort of took a different approach, looking at file by file and seeing if it's a promise of value. And we've just seen them use real world evidence in their reassessment. So something to discuss and see. And I think this, I for sure know this is on the Canadian Drug Agency's radar to look at how this process works as it's been recently implemented. So I should mention that there is one therapy that has received the first time-limited recommendation from Canada's Drug Agency. It's epcoritamab. And just interesting, we can see the path a little bit. So it received its NOCC in October 2023. It then had the HTA submission accepted in November 2023 with a draft recommendation, a time-limited recommendation issued in April 2024. Of note is that we see that the pCPA negotiation engagement letter was issued on April 12th, and that process at the pCPA started in parallel to the Canada's Drug Agency process. So there's a 12-day overlap. There's something interesting and new that provisions in the PTAP process actually lays out to have some parallel negotiation starting. So will this save time for patients? It looks like it's on track, and it will be interesting to see how this drug makes it through the rest of the process. Okay, so let's go down to this level of agreements now. Outcomes-based agreements in Canada, how many are there and what types are there? It is truly difficult to evaluate due to a lack of transparency and the confidential nature of OBAs, but let's look at a little bit of what the research says and what we know. So first of all, the pCPA has acknowledged that there are some outcomes-based agreements in place in Canada. And there has been research ongoing from different folks, including my organization, to help understand the Canadian outcomes-based agreement environment. We see on the right here, this is some academic research that was conducted that all public payers had either negotiated or implemented at least 1 OBA, and 1 has implemented more than 5. Okay, and that there are OBAs implemented today in hepatitis, oncology, HIV, MS, ophthalmology, and cardiology in Canada. Anecdotally, we could estimate there's like 10 to 20 OBAs. It could be simple to a little more complex, but likely more on that simple clinical outcome side on the data piece. So likely a payment model tied to clinical outcomes such as a clinical escalation scale or a regular assessment or measure of progression already in place with therapy for patients. The pCPA back in March gave a great presentation looking at the practical considerations for outcomes-based agreements. And so they did confirm that some simple contract elements have indirect OBA-like features. I'll just highlight a couple of their slides here for you. So they showed some styles of OBAs, and that they're saying the indirect OBA-like contract features. And we can see them there, some things like discontinuation rebate, a free trial period for a drug, or patient caps. So these could all be elements as part of those innovative market access agreements, the agreement column that we saw on those definition pages there. And yeah, so really, in summary, they had said, and I've said it already today, so that some of those contract elements have the objectives to address uncertainties and facilitate access. So really great to see this, this presentation and that information coming from the pCPA about outcomes-based agreements. So now you have an overview of this landscape. It's, you know, all the acronyms. We see the managed access opportunities and how they have enabled timely access abroad, and then all of the different processes that are happening here in Canada. And I'm curious, you know, to look at where does that leave us? We have such a diverse patient population across our country, and then it's quite geographically you know, huge. We have a huge country. We have many different payers and jurisdictions, provincially, private payers as well. And it's so interesting to see what's happening for patients today. And I just wanted to look at one case of what the outcome is of this environment. So where I'm landing with this is that a lack of formalized timely access frameworks has led to inequities in patient access across Canada. We've heard it before, the postal code lottery, and I think a lot of the things that we've seen today contribute to differences across provinces. I wanted to give you this example in spinal muscular atrophy. So where we've seen some large differences between what's going on in Quebec and the rest of Canada. So now you know all about the promise of value. So Spinraza, this is a therapy that received a promise of value therapeutic recommendation, so a positive recommendation back in 2019 in Quebec. And that recommendation included some provisions to list the drug with RWE generation and the clinical follow-up, and said in that recommendation that there'd be a possibility of potentially delisting at a future date based on the insights from the data collected. And we know that now, INESSS has said that they are working on looking at the data and going to be doing a reassessment on this therapy. But what's happened here is that patients in Quebec since 2019 have had access to this therapy. Through CADIT, or Canada's Drug Agency, the same therapy and the same data sets, they received a negative recommendation, or they provided a negative recommendation back in August 2022. There was quite a bit of this real-world data that was used to support this recommendation, and here there were some limitations around the data and the way that it was seen, perhaps missing data, etc. So that's a different question, different sort of discussion on data quality. But I just want to give you this example of it from, the same therapy, or in the same drugs, we could see differing recommendations, which really leads to inequities in access for Canadian patients. And just in that sense, so today, adults in Quebec, they do have access, but all SMA adults that are over 25 years of age do not have access to this treatment. Or really any treatment. Now there's 3 treatments. And you can see here on the right that, there's just different age gaps by that treatment. So we can see that the benefit of formalized timely access frameworks can help level out the equitable access to patients in this country. Okay, so just a few closing thoughts on what is needed to continue to advance the opportunity for timely patient access to novel therapies in this country. So 2 things, or 2 areas that I see that we can all work on together. On the left, one is learning by doing. So it's really important to identify appropriate situations in which managed access agreements and outcomes-based agreements, or any of those other acronyms you saw, innovative agreements, could enable timely patient access. These aren't for every therapy. And really, it's important that we all do that work to make sure that when proposing these types of schemes or agreements, that it makes sense, that it's a good fit. Collaborating with key stakeholders to gain experience will be critical and learn. We're all learning together. There's a pathway, a step and building blocks here that we need to go through. So that experience is really important, and to do that together. Formal managed access agreements are not happening, but we did see that some pieces already exist. Outcomes-based agreements in this country are already happening, but the sharing of best practices has been really limited. So a question I put out to everyone is, how can we ensure transparency with OBAs to promote shared learnings and efficiencies? What works, what doesn't work, learning through examples, patient collaboration and awareness is really important. Patients need to be aware that there is this type of agreement when it's in place. The second sort of food for thought on how to advance this is looking at how do we advance our readiness and capabilities around managed access pathways and innovative market access agreements. So a couple of things. One, I think we really need to just keep working on preparing for a potential future Canadian framework or pathway for managed access and OBAs, starting with roles and responsibilities, Canada's Drug Agency, INESSS, the pCPA, provincial jurisdictions, patients, industry, data holders, all of us, really, there's likely many others. I think it'd be really great if we all keep working on our different part and coming together. Again, it's that collaboration that's critical. Data collection, and RWE expertise. As you remember from earlier in the presentation, a really new thing about these pathways is data. We need to collect data. We need to have data sources that can enable new evidence generation to help advance and support healthcare decision-making when they're faced with so many uncertainties. We've seen here in Canada a lot of progress. The real-world evidence guidelines that came out, I want to say a year and a half ago now. There's work going on by Canada's Drug Agency on rare disease registry data right now, and also looking at data feasibility for OBAs. There's been some work done on that. And then I encourage everyone to continue researching OBA implementation, the how to do these types of agreements and pathways. And there's a lot of folks here in this country working on this. IHE's Health Technology Innovation Platform has fantastic work going on, Montreal and Vivo as well, based in Quebec. And here at 20 Cents, we also have some research happening ongoing. So right now we're looking at, could an OBA be operationalized using real world data from the Canadian Neuromuscular Disease Registry? And also looking at the question of what role should the patient voice have in defining real world outcomes used to adjudicate OBAs? So keep going, everyone. Keep researching, keep working, keep collaborating. I want to encourage all of you. And I just wanted to circle here at the end, like if bring it back to one thing, it's really about preparing for that potential future Canadian framework and pathway that's formalized for managed access and OBAs. So anybody who wants to do a little extra reading, I just wanted to put this on here so you'll have it on the materials that get sent out. There are two recent publications, peer-reviewed publications that came out that our group worked on with some other collaborators on real-world evidence for OBAs. So looking at the Alberta oncology administrative data and seeing if it would be potentially possible, what's already available and possible to use to support an OBA, and also looking at financial characteristics for these agreements and what Canadian public payers and pharmaceutical manufacturers prefer. So you have that link in the documentation. So just to finish off, I wanted to give the last word really of this presentation, or this part anyways, to a patient. And when I think about accelerating patient access and the progress and the possibilities of innovative payment models in Canada, it's all about timely access to patients. That's what this is about. A few years ago, I had the opportunity to speak with Stephanie Stavros. She is the founder and co-director of CF Get Loud, but actually Stephanie is also a CF patient. She made the news in 2020. She became the first person in Canada to be approved for compassionate care for Trikafta, it's a CF therapy. And after tirelessly lobbying the government and the manufacturer of the drug. So we spoke about outcomes-based agreements, and I asked her, what does she see for OBAs for rare disease drugs? And she couldn't put it better. Innovative agreements like OBAs definitely play a role. When a drug shows great promise, but there's uncertainty around efficacy or price, it makes sense to provide the drug first, track the data, and then review and adjust access criteria and price accordingly. It's a common sense approach for people who need quick access. Okay, I want to thank you so much for your attention and time and for learning all these acronyms with me today. And I'm going to hand it over to Ross, and I look forward to the discussion with the panelists.
Allison, thank you so much for a comprehensive, overarching, deep, broad sort of summary of where we sit in Canada today. Clearly, this is a global conversation. You reflected earlier on in your presentation some of the dynamics happening in other jurisdictions, and we may touch on small pieces of that as this conversation goes. But we have questions that are already coming in, which is fantastic. Please feel free, those of you with us, to spend a few moments sort of reflecting on what you'd like the panelists and Allison to sort of bring back to you from a Q&A standpoint. And there is, of course, the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screens. So now we're going to give each of our panelists a chance to reflect a little bit on their own thoughts, experience, and perspectives on this issue, picking up on some of the themes, Allison, that you shared and taking it in their own unique directions. And we ended with a patient quote in your presentation. We're going to start with a patient voice, and we're going to go to you, Lisa Machado.
Amazing. Thank you. And thanks, Allison. That was, as always, a really fabulous overview of everything. Although I have to say, I'm still reeling from all the acronyms. I had no idea that there were that many. What the heck? And so when I hear all the talk about managed access and innovative payment programs, I think that while I get them on a business level, I also, as a patient and someone who, when I was diagnosed with a rare blood cancer many years ago, I only had one medication choice, and if there wasn't a clinical trial, I'm not too sure that I would have had access, and I probably wouldn't be sitting here today. So I guess it's important to point out that it's really hard to wait, especially if you know that there's medication out there that could save your life and, help you be there for your family. So, the other part of this that I find really fascinating, though, is in addition to the access, so you have to figure out how to achieve value. And again, from a patient perspective, I'm going to be pretty hardcore and say that if a medication shows value, man, we have to have access to it. I mean, it's as simple as that. Often, patients, even in our network, if you have to wait for evidence, we just don't have time, right? There isn't a lot of time to wait for that evidence to be gathered. And we know that innovative medicines and therapies are really good for patients, and we deserve them, and our lives depend on them a lot, often, most of the time. And this is especially true, Allison, you mentioned the rare disease space, and lack of access to medication is legendary in that area, as are delays in diagnosis and lack of knowledge and expert care. And I think, what we've seen through your presentation is that, innovative payment models are super complicated. And, I think a lot of patients, you alluded to this, Allison, that a lot of patients don't really know or understand these agreements, but they need to know when they are in place. But it's also really important to acknowledge that this is a giant opportunity for Canada to encourage access to medications, but also to allow patients to get their hands on, and I guess, research and like R&D to get our hands on valuable data. And most importantly is to improve outcomes for patients. And I suppose the flip side of all of this is that there are things that need to be in place for it to work. And I think most importantly, we need a commitment from our government, from decision makers, that when these models are in place, that there's going to be, decision-making frameworks, and also things like stakeholder engagement, right? I believe that patients should be engaged from the very beginning, and also during and after. I mean, we need to know about these agreements and also feed back into, how we think they're going to work best. And I think that's all I'll say right now.
Lisa, thanks for that. There's many questions that have already popped up that have elements of the patient perspective reflected in them. So we will come back to you and others on that key subject, but we appreciate you kicking this off. Nicole, we're going to go to you for some thoughts from yourself/Canada's Drug Agency.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity, and I sincerely apologize that I'm having technical issues here with unplanned work on the road with our my IT provider. So I'm coming to you from my phone and hoping in the background everything will work out. So thanks very much. I mean, Allison, what a great presentation from what I heard of it. And then Lisa, your comments about the patient perspective are always really important and at the forefront of the work that we do at Canada's Drug Agency. Maybe I could just say a few things. I'm glad, Allison, you ended with the need for collaboration, right? This will not happen with one group alone. This will happen with multiple partners, including patients and clinicians and industry and various organizations across the healthcare institutions, including the regulator all the way to the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance. And remember, even the title alone, sort of speaks to that, what lane are we in? We're in the lane of looking at evidence. And the pCPA, the other acronym there, Allison, is really about thinking about the negotiations. So what information can we then provide to the decision makers along with, to help improve the way that they can do negotiations. And so as we think about evidence and, on my sort of own bucket list are things around transparency and evidence and expand the evidence base. So when we talk about outcomes-based agreement, the O refers to an outcome, and the outcome can be, I've heard a lot about the efficacy or the effectiveness part of it. There's also a safety part of it. So how do we continue to build that evidence? And are there other sources of evidence outside of a clinical trial platform that we can leverage, for example? I think that that's some of the work that we're doing to try and at least to provide some standards or some guidance on, what are the appropriate kinds of tools or protocols or study designs that can be used to help answer those kinds of questions. Keep in mind, clinical trials have been around since, I think the last time I checked Wikipedia, my source for things, was, the 1500s was the first clinical trial. As we're thinking about non-randomized clinical trials, we're still working on methods and trying to understand the best way to come up with how to measure effectiveness and safety. And there are lots of different kinds of tools to do that. And I think that that's some of the work that we're doing to help us get to, if we get to a point where we have an outcomes-based agreement, how do we then decide on that outcome actually has the value it needs to have? And then moreover, how do we choose the outcome? So some of the work that we're doing there also then advances the collaboration with the patients and the clinicians and the payers and industry to help decide what are the most appropriate outcomes to help us decide that we've actually either achieved a benefit or not. And how do we validate that along the way? I think there are some other things that we're doing along the way and will be helpful, to increasing transparency, is around ensuring that when we have data that comes from non-clinical trial platforms for real world evidence, and the data space, and Allison, you talked about the data space, what actually, what are the expectations or what are the kinds of standards and guidelines? And you referred to our guideline document that we had released about a year ago. There's also work that we're doing on, the part of, you had a couple of examples, and before I actually had to leave unexpectedly to come back, where there, different jurisdictions have made different decisions and on similar or the same product. And I think part of that is around unpacking what's the value and what was included in the decision making and also in the deliberation, particularly around as we think about the whole process of deliberation, there's an input, a throughput, and an output. What is the input part? And so how do we start to think about what is valuable? And Lisa, one of the things you talked about, value to the patient, is it caregiver? Is it burden? Is it activities of daily living? Is it a societal perspective? And so how do we start to incorporate that? And our organization has moved into that space for certainly complex technologies and continuing to understand that value and making sure that that kind of information then becomes part of the deliberation as well. There's also, I think, Allison, you might have mentioned in the talk about time-limited reviews and even Target Zero. I mean, those are two initiatives where we're trying to shorten that period of time between, the regulatory approval and then also the work that we do, particularly around, making sure that we can do that in a concurrent way instead of a consecutive way. But keep in mind that we often our time often starts when the manufacturer submits to us. So I think that there are some ways that we can work around that, with especially with Target Zero, and having those kinds of submissions aligned not only with the regulator and with us. So I think we're very pleased to be part of this discussion and really be hopefully a partner in this discussion about how to move forward and think about access in a different way. Thank you.
Nicole, thanks for fighting through multiple screens and platforms to get back to us. It's lovely to have you again. Raelynn, if you want to put the particular jurisdictional perspective into this and talk from a provincial payer, and we'd love to hear your thoughts as well.
Well, thank you, Ross, for the opportunity, and it's so great to be part of this esteemed panel. I feel so privileged to hear, directly from Nicole and Lisa and Allison and the others that will be speaking. It's quite an opportunity to have this conversation, so thank you. And Allison, I've heard you speak a number of times, and in fact, she came and presented to my pharmaceutical policy and appropriateness team of pharmacists here in the Saskatchewan Ministry not too long ago, because I want them to hear from her directly, this eloquent voice helping to cut through the clutter and the noise and the acronyms. We are really fortunate to have organizations like yours, Allison, deep diving with your expertise and your knowledge into this space, because it is complex and it is sometimes confusing. So really feel fortunate to be able to have access to your intelligence and your innovation and all of that stuff. So amazing. And I really appreciated your presentation because, I agree with you. I think there are some key learnings here that from my desk I can help advance. A small province, we obviously are very concerned about value and affordability. We don't have the deep pockets that maybe BC and Ontario and Quebec have. But learning from those jurisdictions, what is INESSS doing? What does the CDA suggest? What can we get from pCPA? These are bodies that will help inform us as we move forward in this space. So I think we're in a really interesting and exciting time for pharmaceuticals. But maybe what I can lend to you today is a little bit of that sober perspective on how hard it is to get funding approved. I'm working on a couple of CDIs, here's another acronym for you, cabinet decision items on two key files that are really important to us. One is the National Strategy for Drugs for Rare Disease. As you know, we have a proposal from the federal government. Having everyone in my province agree on an approach is not as easy as you might think. So we've got an item going to cabinet at the end of June, the day before the council or conference of deputy ministers meet in Halifax on the 27th. They want a decision from provinces on whether we're signing on or not. And I would say, yes, that's money on the table, let's go. But I don't necessarily speak for my deputy minister or her peers and our premier health minister. So there's a lot that goes into a simple decision, like, are we going to participate in a program that is going to be cost shared? There's clearly new revenue on the table. It will potentially reduce some of our costs because we're going to be spending money on rare disease anyway. So even a fairly simple conversation like that is really challenging. The other cabinet decision item that I'm moving forward for the same timeline, hopefully, is how do we expand scope of practice for pharmacists so that if we have everyone working to the highest scope of practice, we can save some money in the system so that we can afford our healthcare system. And so every dollar we spend, whether I can absorb it in my large, $500 million budget, or we have to ask for new money, is scrutinized very carefully. And it's really challenging for me not only to get all of my peers in my own building agreeing on what is an approach for new policy like pharmacy scope expansion. What are the implications to the other parts of the healthcare system? Who's going to be lining up next to lobby for that same privilege of charging a fee for a service? So I just share that with you so that you know that it is complex and it is really hard to spend $1 of taxpayers' money unless we have evidence, unless we have proof. And so, I'm excited by, the world that we have being presented to us. Precision medicine, innovation, timely access, these are incredibly important. I would love to say yes to everything, but I have to be cautious, and I have to kind of help to provide that balanced perspective in that, you know, our government's going to election this fall, and they would like to be reelected. And so how do they best spend that, you know, pie of money when the highways need work, education needs work, we need to build things, we need technology. It's really a difficult place, I think, for politicians who essentially are making these decisions on, should I fund $1 million drug or should I put $1 million into a highway? So while, you know, when you take it down to the individual level, of course you want to say yes to every patient. But just knowing that these are complicated questions for decision makers. And so thankfully, we've got organizations like CDA and others helping us to sort through the evidence. And I hear you, Allison, you know, let's learn by doing. Let's, you know, we like to pilot things. Let's take some good examples and see what we can do. Obviously, collaboration and learning best practices, you know, where we can communicate clearly across provinces amongst our peers and learn from those best practices. I'm all for it. And just the other lens I might add, as an executive director responsible for a team of about 70 people post-COVID, I'm doing everything I can to hold on to the pharmacists on my team. But can I afford to pay them what they are worth? And how do I retain and engage these exemplary professionals to continue to do this work? So a lot of my job is HR, you know, really trying to support not only the retention of these professionals, but their key learnings on, you know, the kind of work you're talking about here today, having them travel to participate in training that's going on in Ottawa or wherever. So that's one of my main priorities, is to keep the team healthy and strong. And to open the doors for conversation with the researchers and the innovators who are doing some pretty exciting things. So thank you for allowing me to share that.
Great. Thank you, Raelynn. It's a lot of balls in the air and a lot of different perspectives, so we appreciate you bringing them to this conversation. Andrea, close us off with some thoughts and advice and insights from the world of Roche and beyond.
Yeah, I mean, as I kind of listened to the presentation and all the comments, I think I have this hope, right? And even with Raelynn's dose of reality, I think there's hope and promise when it comes to innovative agreements. And if I look back, Allison, you talked very earlier about sort of the type of products that are coming to the market, novel therapies, high unmet need, promise, maybe with phase 2 data. And I take that example into mind and think of, well, what are the challenges that a manufacturer face? I think in this particular space, we look for, you know, products, the high unmet need that we want to make happen. And under the current, you know, we have TLR as something that we're piloting, but for these types of products, we don't actually have a managed entry pathway in Canada to go through. And so if it goes through CADIT, then there's clinical uncertainty and we get a negative. Well, where is it that we go from there, right? And your SMA was a good example in adults, where if we don't have that as a positive, we do have potential of addressing some uncertainty, but what is the path to move forward there? So there's that one piece of not having a pathway to move forward. The other piece of it, if we look specifically at components of an OBA, well, how does a manufacturer start prepping for where we think an OBA makes sense? And we usually even do this like pre-CADIT, and we look at, well, what are the potential access challenges that we have in being able to launch this product? And one of them, if we think of high unmet need, you know, clinical uncertainty may be an OBA, because it lends itself well to, okay, well, there's uncertainty. How do we address that uncertainty? But there is no, we don't know for sure, right, whether this could work or whether pCPA may be open to this. So we kind of go into this thinking, I think, right, I assume that this could be a potential pathway. And the components of an OBA, well, what is the outcome that we should be measuring? Some cases it might be obvious, others don't. So then we reach out to stakeholders and we find what's the relevant outcomes. What data should be collected, right? Is there consensus of where we collect the data? Is there a registry? Does it include all patients within the registry, right? Do we keep it simple as OBA, right? How willing are stakeholders in pCPA willing to accept some kind of surrogate or proxy data for certain provinces or PSPs? And then we have the third component of implementation considerations. So for example, If an outcome is based on discontinuation, well, what are all the reasons why a patient might discontinue? Is it based on performance, or is it for other reasons? So if we break down those components of going in with, I think it's going to work, right? I think, but not sure about the outcomes, not sure about the data that can be collected, not 100% sure about the implementation considerations. It's just information that we're gathering. And then we get to a place where we're negotiating with pCPA. Well, that's very late in the process to know, no, it doesn't work. No, we don't agree on collecting that data. So all of that to say is like those are things that I think potentially we can work together on. There are other considerations such as the financial risks that we need to consider as a manufacturer and global approvals that we need to consider. But I think that conversation can happen much earlier, right? When we talk about accelerated access. So I break it down to two conflicting words, right? It is predictable and flexible. So predictable in that if we are coming out with a product, we know it fits a good profile of high unmet needs. This is a path that we can go down and explore. So there's kind of some kind of certainty, predictability, and being able to explore that. Then there is a predictable pathway that we can actually engage all stakeholders, right? What are the relevant outcomes, the data that's being collected, implementation considerations, and is there transparency to why the data is being collected? What are the expectations of access? So if there is a pathway that gives clarity to that, the flexibility piece comes because ultimately, what are we trying to achieve? It is accelerated access, and part of that is the access, right? So it's not good if it's a quick no, right? We want to ensure that there's access, and the flexibility can help us get there. And so when we start thinking about things sort of innovative agreements is because we think there's actually going to be challenges, right? The current structure we think doesn't fit well. And so we're looking at all these different ways in order to make that happen, that Canadians have the best access to therapy as possible in a very timely manner. So there has to be some flexibility within the system. So I think that those couple of things, I totally align with Allison. I think that we need to learn by doing, right? I think we actually, there's been a lot of work, 20 Cents, IHE, in vivo, that we can start getting together, pulling stakeholders together to start structuring, well, what could this look like? And it has to be multi-stakeholder, right? Incorporating the different perspectives.
Andrea, that was fantastic. Thank you for sort of trying in some ways to weave together many different perspectives and thoughts, both from Allison's presentation and your own research and lots of comments you heard from other people. So this is fantastic. So we've got a great foundation. We've got lots of questions that have already come in, and I'm going to do my best to get as many of them to you guys as possible in the next sort of 22 minutes or so. So maybe I'll start, Allison, by coming back to you if I can. We had a couple of questions with folks reflecting on, or asking you to reflect on, experience globally on, who and how best are outcomes measured? Like, how do you manage the conflicts in terms of who should be actually determining if, in fact, the promise and potential is being realized? And then in those instances where perhaps it's not, have there been examples or learnings for Canada of when treatments have been discontinued or reimbursement's been withdrawn? So maybe a little bit about the devil in the details around who gets to track and determine if what's supposed to be happening is happening, and perhaps if it's not, how is that played out, and what do we take away from that?
Yeah, sure. Okay, this is a question with a lot of different elements to it because it's data and process and whatnot. So I'll start globally with an example, and I looked to the UK. So they have, for their oncology drugs, they have a managed access pathway and a specific fund called the Cancer Drugs Fund. So in 2022, they did an analysis between 2016 and 2022, all of the drugs that went through. So they had 22 drugs that were part of that pathway. And they looked at how many coming out of that process were actually recommended for routine listing. So that would say at the end of the process, it's getting a positive recommendation and it's also being listed ongoing. It doesn't mean it's listed with the same criteria, but is it listed or patients have access? So it was 86%, I think it was 18 of the 22 drugs. Or 19 of the 22 drugs actually were recommended ongoing after the managed access process and the reevaluation to be put into routine listing. So on the flip side, we could say, there is 14% of therapies that fell off that were not recommended. But it was interesting to see them do that analysis. So they looked at for the drugs that did go through this whole process and had data collected, patients had access during that period. They were able to evaluate, they were able to reevaluate, and then make a changing to the listing process. So that's one thing. And I think also if we, here in Canada, the hope would be to get to a process where we have provisions for that listing, evaluation, reevaluation, collect the data, see how it works, and then measure and adjust accordingly. That has to be a part of the plan. The second thing I'll say is like I think there's questions around data, like who collects the data, who's measuring him. So first of all, each therapy, it will be different. And that's a little bit difficult to say like, okay, we want a process, but then each therapy will have a different patient population, a different need, potential data sources that are different across the country. So I think it will still be on a case-by-case basis. And this is where it's a bit difficult because it won't just go into like box A, box B, or box C. It's like we're going to have to look at each patient population. Where is the data? Where are the patients across Canada? Can we use data from where there's a good high quality data with high patient representativeness? Let's say it might be in one province's administrative data or one patient registry. Could that be used to evaluate or adjudicate an innovative market access agreement across the whole country? So that's where I go back to, principles like the RWE guidance that CADTH put out last year. It's very important that, any data that we use, real world data that is going to be used for real world evidence generation, it has to adhere to those criteria. And that's a great base. The data has to be of high quality. Then who selects what the outcomes are? Again, it's a case-by-case basis. And I can see Lisa on my screen here. I've had lots of conversations with her about what outcomes are meaningful to patients. And it likely is not, well, not likely, I'd say it could be different than what's in the clinical trial. It could be different than the HTA assessment. It could be something that's not in either of those. And that is so important that that conversation happens in conjunction with patients to make sure that whatever's being evaluated actually makes sense for them, and that they have control over, is this good or bad for me as a patient, and don't see their access just taken away because it wasn't hitting an endpoint in the clinical trial. So it's very high level summary of what I tried to say here. It's like we need processes, but we also need flexibility in that, and then that collaboration of dialogue, because it will be different based on each therapy, each situation, each patient population.
Allison, thanks for taking 3 questions that I fused into one and actually attempting to answer all of them. That's lovely. Lisa, I think maybe that's a great segue. We'll sort of swing the mic back to you to reflect a little bit on sort of the importance of the patient voice, processes and mechanisms for optimal engagement of patients along this journey. Would love your thoughts on that. And then Nicole, I'm going to come to you after this, maybe to talk a little bit about the CDA's work on data registries and sort of how we deal with this kind of fragmented, suboptimal data landscape across the country, so that doesn't become a rate limiting factor so much. But Lisa, to you first.
Yeah, so I have so many things to say that have nothing
amazing.
Have nothing to do with your question, though, Ross.
Oh, not so amazing.
But I wanted to point out one thing about what Raelynn was saying. So thanks for that overview. I think that's super helpful. But it is, I got to tell you, really hard for a patient and someone living with a disease that could kill me one of these days to hear you measure the costs, that you're facing. So you're measuring the price of a highway versus the cost of reimbursing or supporting or paying for or getting drug to patients. And for me, that's really difficult to hear. And I wonder if there's an issue of, I don't know, priorities maybe or something. But that's one comment that I wanted to say. But I also, listening to all this, I think it's really fascinating how it feels like we're trying to fit the patient into these models. And I'm wondering if maybe it's better to flip it, right? And so instead of defining the model that that works, like maybe we start thinking about it differently, right? And so let's turn it into payment models that fit the therapeutic area or fit the patient experience or fit the patient needs, and then start with the patient as opposed to going from the other way. And I know that didn't answer your question at all, Ross, but there are my 2 cents.
That's okay. No, thank you. And we'll come back to you on more reflections as we keep going through all these questions. So thanks, Lisa. Nicole, do you want to pick up on the data piece? There's a couple of comments about, we have a pretty fragmented data infrastructure in Canada, and so we may have the best of aspirations, but if we can't actually gather what we need to assess what we need to assess, then we're going to get stuck in the clouds and not down on the ground.
Yeah, I mean, thanks very much, Ross. And I think, so I have lots of thoughts too, and hopefully some of them are related to your question. So then we will go through that. I mean, I think there certainly is some work required. When we review or appraise the evidence, we often have to understand what that evidence is. And so Allison referred to our guidance document, and this is really an opportunity for us to think about, to understand the study designs so that we can see if those results are actually, how uncertain they are based on the study design. And really that's the kind of work that we do. And so in the registry space, because we know that clinical trials are coming with more and more sort of immature data, not the usual sort of cadence of phase 3 trials, are there other sources of information? So our work at Canada's Drug Agency has been looking at for different registries as sources of data. So patient registries, particularly disease registries, particularly, and trying to understand, the quality of those registries. And we have a current and active RFP out for registry holders, owners, individuals who run registries, whether those are patient groups, academic groups, whether they are industry funded or grant funded, to bolster some of the work in their registries to start to improve the kinds of standards. And that could be anything from governance. Did everybody get consented? Do they agree to share your information with us? All of those things. I think the other thing is we're very open to testing and learning and succeeding and failing. And I think that is a little bit of a new a vision for us, and even just for us to articulate, we do need to try things and trial. And so TLR, so the time limited reviews that you referred to earlier on, is a trial. Like, how do we actually identify the right kinds of products and then have them in the system where we continue to collect evidence along the way. And so that's sort of a trial for us, target zero, making sure that industry and sponsors know that they can actually check a box to make sure that our reviews are aligned along the way. We are looking at trialing things around not only evidence, but then also ensuring that that we have access to data in a different way. And actually, Canada's Drug Agency, I mean, there are 3 different groups of work under that portfolio. One is appropriate use, one is data and analytics, and the other one is convenership. And as you think about the conversation we had today, it is all about convening and making sure we have access to certain kinds of data to help us along the way. And so what are the health system issues? So the comment about the fragmented system, yes, but there are other ways that we can manage that. Can we link easier? Are there certain governance structures? We've been talking about privacy for more than 2 decades. Can we finally land this? How do we share data? Who's responsible for looking at the data? How do we support an infrastructure to allow us to do this? And, Health Canada has invested in CIHI, to look at significantly to look at, data and getting new data sets and thinking about different ways to approach data along the way. So I think as we pull all these pieces together, that will help us with the ecosystem and help us get the information that we need to make decisions, or at least inform the decision makers from our perspective, provide the evidence that the decision makers need to help them decide on whether to fund or not fund.
Nicole, thanks for unpacking that, and obviously lots happening in your space and at CDA on this.
Can I add just maybe one comment? And one of
Andrea, please.
Yeah, Allison, and you had presented, and some of the research that's done is, could we actually use the data that exists now for things like OBAs? And I think sometimes, and you mentioned, Nicole, like the flexibility, because I don't think that we have to get the entire system set up and linked, which I think we should. But when we start looking at things like innovative agreements, OBA, I think there can be some flexibility in how we incorporate. So pCPA had said OBA-like, could there be some kind of precursor or surrogate that we could use in order for us to reach an agreement? Ultimately, it's about being able to, get access for patients, for Canadians. So what are all the ways that we can do it that is reasonable, right? So just to say that I think that there are opportunities now with the way the system is set up now for us to be able to do these types of agreements.
And then maybe Ross, can I just jump in there too?
Of course.
I think one of the things that I didn't mention, because it wasn't part of your question, I tried to really focus on your question, but Andrea, you highlighted the earlier engagement. And I think we have something right now, it's called an early scientific advice program, but that's often quite early in the system, right? So before a phase 3 clinical trial is being designed, to come in to say, what are the kinds of parameters that would be important for an HDA to consider? And so thinking about trial designs, but we also know that often trial designs are created globally. And so what we say as one jurisdiction may not fit with all of the other jurisdictions or may not be aligned. So we're listening very carefully. We've had a number of, we've heard particularly from our patient partners, our industry partners, that, an earlier engagement is important, but at the right stage, right? And so this is another thing, the day before a submission is not the right stage. 3 or 4 or 5 years before the submission is also not the right stage. So is there some sweet spot in between? Yeah. So we're actively looking at that to see, because then we can have a conversation around what is the kind of evidence you are thinking of generating or that you have, and even provide some commentary or some thoughts. We know, for example, we've created inventories of rare disease registries, or we know where the administrative databases are, or we know that we've been working with the Health Data Research Network on all the provincial data. And so, what are the outcomes, and can we find them in a specific place, right? And I think provide some guidance there, or here's the kind of study we would like. We still don't know what the outcomes are, right? But you can at least provide some guidance or some recommendations around the kinds of evidence that could actually be suitable for then a submission or a resubmission, for example. So we're actively looking at those opportunities.
Raelynn, maybe I'll swing to you. So a couple of comments from folks sort of empathizing with the challenge you face, where you have sort of the cost that you're articulating and sort of carrying up to cabinet versus the cost of the Ministry of Transportation, the Ministry of Education, sort of this giant bun fight of who gets to sort of emerge triumphant. If we're going to move down the road towards managed access agreements, which are going to be inherently more complex and perhaps more resource intensive than sort of standard traditional arrangements, how do we as a community make it easier for you to focus on the innovation and the outcomes you're getting from these agreements, rather than the sort of cost and complexity of making them or doing them, or even frankly, just the cost of the inputs in the first place? Like what do you need from us so that when you go into these conversations, you feel like you have the ability to articulate in a compelling way, what you need to embark on this, on these agreements, and also ultimately to secure the funds you need to pay for them?
Well, thanks for the question. And I see the comments in the chat and those vocalized by Lisa. I totally empathize, and I understand this is maybe sounding harsh, to compare your situation to a highway. That's not my intent. I think, we have such compassionate people working in the healthcare system, and we want to do the very best we can. And so, to be kind of cheeky, Ross, I'd say, what can you do? Send me a check, because I think it comes down to funding. If Health Canada approves a drug, you have access to it. How we pay for it, whether that cost is shared, whether it's fully funded by government, that's the tricky question. And I think, we do the best we can to provide evidence. And I'm very sensitive, maybe is the word, to gatekeeping. I've been out of government for 10 years. And so when I come back and I'm making the case to make the best investment in healthcare, and I have gatekeepers all the way along the line, not even allowing me to have the conversation with those who will be making the decision, I'm very much in tune with that. And I find it incredibly frustrating. So if we had a chance to go for a beer or a glass of wine, you'd hear some of my stories about how I'm fighting the fight. I feel like a black sheep. I feel like I'm constantly going to battle. But how do you continue to have the voice that's listened to, right? So it's change management. It's building relationships. It's showing evidence. It's convincing people that this is the right thing to do with compassionate words and evidence to say, we need to fund this. But in any given moment, a process or a timeline or something else might prevent all that good work from happening. So, more seriously than, sending me a check, Ross, I think conversations like this certainly help to help people understand the various perspectives and the challenges we're all facing. I think we all believe in this. We have a common goal. We want timely and equitable access. And if we have the federal government leading the charge on some of these things, that helps the provinces align to say, okay, contraception and diabetes drugs, clearly everyone needs it. Let's see what we can do across Canada. What's next? What are the common drugs that everyone is grappling with affordability on? So I hope that answers the question, and just want to leave you with the impression that I do feel the emotion and the pain you're expressing, and we're doing the best we can to try to connect the dots and make those sound decisions.
Raelynn, thanks for that. Andrea, I want to come to you. And as I was reflecting on the Michel de Guise quote that Allison shared, the realistic was an interesting term, word that was sort of embedded within that. And you talked about sort of some of the thinking you guys have done within Roche to sort of assess, what are the optimal kind of therapeutic areas, what are the optimal models, what's the right timing, how do we get upfront too soon, but not soon enough, but not too soon. All the sorts of things that Nicole was referencing as well. Can you reflect a little bit on as you assess the opportunities, what does sort of realistic or optimal look like from a Roche perspective? Like, how do you internally determine it's going to work for this, it's not going to work for this, let's try this approach with this? How do you make it realistic and compelling at the same time?
Yeah, I mean, that part is difficult because it is an assumption on our part, but I think it comes down to, well, what is the major challenge that we're going to focus on? And actually, INC has a good framework when it comes to innovative agreements, because the approach depends on the challenge that we have, right? So if we're trying to solve a problem, and quite often we make that decision on, okay, there's a number of things surrounding the area. We get inputs from various stakeholders from a global, and we take it down to a local level as well to say, okay, what do we think is going to be the major challenge? And if it's clinical uncertainty, this is what it looks like. If it's cell and gene therapy, there's a clinical component piece, and maybe there's an amortization piece, as we've seen with other countries. And that's how we kind of estimate, yeah, this is where we need to invest and actually look at innovative payment models. Whether or not we know that whether it's going to work and the types of challenges associated, it's much more challenging to do alone or one-on-one, connecting with different stakeholders in the system. And I think that's where, and we've seen this in other countries, this is where I think we can learn and actually gather stakeholders together. And I think we're close, right, Ross? I think even as Roche, what we've been trying to do is highlight what those challenges are, being a part of 20 Cents, being a part of IHE, to bring those so that there is a multi-stakeholder forum for us to discuss and hopefully be able to create something, right? So we're at that stage right now. We've kind of invested, this is the challenge that we see on products coming in the future. How can we get quicker access? So we're not going down the path and only finding this problem during a negotiation case. We're actually thinking of this even before we submit to CADIT, that we think this is a very important high unmet need product that needs, I guess, more emphasis, more concentration on, and how do we get those various stakeholders aligned to develop what this looks like? Again, I think we're close. I think we're at that point, and how do we actually make that happen? And so that's, I guess, the call to action, is that we've got a number of studies, we've got a number of interested parties, and actually trying to, how do we actually make the difference? And now how do we actually put that in action and learn by doing, as Allison pointed out.
Andrea, thanks for that. Allison, I'm going to give you maybe the last word on this, and I'll give you sort of one question you might want to work into your kind of final thoughts. And somebody asked a thoughtful comment around, when you look outside therapeutics, are there examples in vaccines and medical devices, in other forms of health innovation, that might be able to be leveraged or learned from? We certainly talked about examples in therapeutics outside Canada. Are there other examples within Canada, or even more broadly, in different kinds of examples of health technology innovation that we might be able to pull in to help further advance this work? So I'll leave you with that and the microphone for a couple of minutes, and then we'll just give very brief closing remarks and free people to their afternoons.
Fantastic. I have to say that question outside of pharmaceuticals, I'm not really the best person to ask for that.
Fair.
So maybe that's a homework question for me.
Excellent.
I can take a look. Really focused on seeing how to enable timely access to medicine. So I would just say, to reiterate from the presentation, I think there's so much internationally that we can look to for best practices. And then we have so many of the pieces that are already there. Can we get to the implementation part now And I'm looking at Lisa on the screen, Raelynn, Nicole, Andrea, and others in the ecosystem, the pCPA, other jurisdictions, other patients. We have to make this, we have to figure this out, because Canada can't be 18th of 20 for access to new therapies in a year and a half, when other countries and other patients who, just because they were born somewhere and patients in Canada weren't in that country, they have access. So we want that good news story here as well. And I think just encourage everyone to keep working together. I'll end on that.
Allison, it's a perfect way to end, and thank you for underlining the essence of the actual point of all of this, which is getting people what they need faster. Closing remarks. I will pass the mic momentarily to John Fears, the Director of Government Affairs and Public Policy at AstraZeneca. But just quickly before I pass it to John, I'll remind folks or let everyone know that the recording of this session and Allison's slides will be made available in the next sort of 24 hours. We'll have something back to all of the people who RSVP'd with a little bit more information about this session, the relevant information that you'll want to reflect on as you go forward, and maybe a bit more about the Resilient Healthcare Coalition at the same time. So thank you all for being a part of this. We've kept our numbers almost at 100% through the whole arc of this conversation, which shows how much it matters and how engaging all of you found it. So a huge thank you to the panelists and the attendees. This has been a pleasure and an honor to be a part of. So with that, John Fears.
Thanks, Ross. Thanks to all the panelists for an incredible discussion. The 90 minutes flew by. I learned a ton, and I've been in many of these discussions. So just on behalf of everyone and the hundreds of people on the line that joined, thank you. I will not summarize any of the remarks because you guys have done a great job. I will leave with two thoughts to consider as we go to the rest of our day and week. The first is we've talked a lot about risk sharing, and I do think that's really, really important. I would argue that the way our system is structured now, it's sequential, it's multi-jurisdictional, it puts 100% of the risk for waiting on patients. And I think that as the smart folks on this call, we can work together to implement these frameworks, build and implement frameworks to share risk around data, reputation, financing, so that patients aren't left holding most of the risk for the timelines and delays. So that's one piece. And that's as much a call to action to industry as it is to our other public sector decision makers. It's a shared responsibility. And the second piece is, as we look to these international jurisdictional examples, and as we think about how can we accelerate access, one of the key pieces is that international jurisdictions that do this do a lot of things in parallel. And so there's a huge kudos to be called out for Health Canada and CADTH or CDA working in parallel with a number of their processes. How can we bring that to the provincial and pCPA level so that, again, patients can access in parallel to some of these financial discussions and maybe, managed entry agreement discussions that are happening? Again, we see other European nations doing this. Can we do this here in Canada? I think we can. And I think it's on all of us to work together and deliver that. So again, thanks very much, everyone. Looking forward to continuing this conversation.
Thanks so much, John. And thanks all of you. We hope we see you again soon.
Cheers.
Thank you.